Hello there, and welcome back to a quiet corner of the past. Take a moment, if you will, to settle yourself somewhere truly comfortable. Perhaps you're already nestled beneath that familiar weighted blanket, the one that seems to understand exactly how your shoulders carry the day's tension. Maybe you're curled up in that chair by the window, the one that's molded itself to your shape over countless evenings just like this one. Or perhaps you're lying in bed, finally horizontal after a day spent vertical, feeling gravity gently pull away the accumulated stress from your limbs. Let the concerns of today begin to dissolve, like footprints in snow after a night of gentle wind. Whatever deadlines are lurking in tomorrow's corners, whatever notifications are blinking on silent devices, whatever small anxieties are whispering in the back of your mind, let them drift away for now. They'll still be there later if you need them. But right now, in this moment, they have no claim on you. Tonight, we're going to journey together to an era when life was truly inconvenient. A world without Wi-Fi, without food delivery, and certainly without memory foam pillows. We're traveling back to visit the remarkably challenging existence of the Neanderthals. But here's the beautiful contradiction we're embracing. Though their lives were filled with mammoth hunts and sudden blizzards, bitter cold and constant vigilance, our story tonight will be exactly the opposite. It will be gentle, steady, and perhaps wonderfully boring enough to guide you towards sleep. Picture, if you can, the contrast. While they huddled around flickering fires and damp caves, you're surrounded by modern comfort. While they listened anxiously for the distant howl of cave lions, you're hearing nothing more threatening than the soft hum of your heating system, the gentle tick of a clock, maybe the whisper of wind through trees outside your window. Their world was one of sharp edges and sudden dangers, where every sunset brought the very real possibility that tomorrow might not come. Your world, the one surrounding you right now, is soft and safe and predictable. Feel the difference in your bones. Notice how your muscles can truly relax, how your breathing can slow and deepen. Because unlike our ancient relatives, you don't need to sleep with one ear open for predators. The Neanderthals lived in a time when comfort was a luxury almost beyond imagination. A dry place to sleep was a victory. A full belly was a celebration. Warmth was something you fought for every single day. But you have all of these things effortlessly. Your bed is dry and warm. Your hunger is satisfied. Your safety is assured. And so, as we step back through time together, let their struggles serve as a gentle reminder of just how peaceful your present moment truly is. If you'd like, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Are we both looking up at the same star-filled sky, or are we separated by oceans and time zones? Are you in a bustling city where the lights never quite fade, or somewhere quiet where darkness still means something? There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing that, despite the miles or hours between us, we're sharing this particular silence, this gentle pause in the endless rush of modern life. Whether you're in a small apartment where the neighbor's footsteps create a soft percussion above your head, or in a house where the only sounds are the settling of old wood and the distant murmur of a refrigerator, we're creating this pocket of calm together. In a world that never quite stops moving, never fully quiets down, we're carving out this space for stories that move slowly, breathe deeply, and ask nothing more of you than to simply listen. So settle in a little deeper. Adjust that pillow one more time. Pull that blanket up to exactly where it feels most comforting. We're about to open a door to the distant past. But ironically, that journey backward is going to help you move forward into the gentle embrace of sleep. Now, take a deep breath in and let it out slowly. As you exhale, imagine that with each breath you release, you're stepping backward through time thousands of years, then tens of thousands of years. The past flows by like invisible pages turning, each one taking you further from the familiar world of smartphones and traffic lights, further from the steady hum of electricity and the comforting glow of street lamps outside your window. With each gentle breath, the present grows more distant. The sounds of your modern world, the subtle whir of air conditioning, the distant murmur of late-night television from a neighbor's apartment, the occasional car passing on the street below, all of these fade into silence. You're drifting backward through time, through the centuries of human progress, past the age of kingdoms and empires, past the first cities and the discovery of agriculture, past the very beginning of what we call civilization. Keep breathing slowly, steadily, as we travel together through this river of time. We stop in a place that existed 100,000 years ago. The air here is cold and clean in a way that's almost shocking, so pure it would make your lungs tingle if you could truly breathe it. This is air that has never known the exhaust of a single engine, never been touched by factory smoke or city smog. It carries the sharp, crystalline scent of ice and stone, mixed with the green smell of hardy plants that grow in places where life clings stubbornly to existence. Listen. There are no mechanical sounds here, no distant highway traffic, no airplane engines drawing white lines across the sky, no air conditioning units humming their steady songs. Instead, there's the whistle of wind threading through massive granite boulders, carved and polished by countless winters. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the call of a bird, a long, haunting note, unlike anything in your modern world. The voice of a species you've never encountered, singing to a sky that humans are only just beginning to understand. The landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in tough, scrubby vegetation, broken by valleys where streams run clear and cold. The trees here are survivors, twisted and weathered by winds that carry the breath of glaciers. Everything feels vast and empty and untamed, as if the earth itself is still deciding what it wants to become. And there, beneath a rocky overhang that provides some shelter from the endless sky, are the people we've come to meet. They're not what you might expect. They're not the hunched, grunting cavemen of old cartoons, dragging clubs and sporting confused expressions. No, these are the true masters of this harsh world. They are Neanderthals, and they are extraordinary. Their bodies are built for this place, shorter and more compact than modern humans, with broad shoulders and powerful hands that can grip stone tools for hours without tiring. Their faces are distinctive, with prominent brow ridges and large noses that warm the frigid air before it reaches their lungs. These people know things that we've forgotten. They can read the weather and the behavior of insects, predict the movement of herds by examining tracks that are days old, and create fire from nothing but stone and dry grass. They can survive winters that would kill most modern humans within hours. They are, in every sense, the experts of their world. But here's the thing about expertise in the Ice Age. It's absolutely exhausting. Think for a moment about your to-do list from today. Perhaps it included answering some emails, stopping by the grocery store, maybe doing a load of laundry, or tidying up the kitchen. Maybe you needed to call your insurance company or remember to take out the trash. Mundane tasks, certainly, but nothing that required you to risk your life. Now consider their daily agenda. 1. Survive until sunset. 2. Try not to become dinner for a cave bear. 3. Find something edible that isn't moss or tree bark. 4. Repeat tomorrow. Their entire existence was a constant negotiation with a world that was actively trying to kill them through cold, through hunger, through predators, through 1,000 different kinds of accident and misfortune. Every single day was a masterclass in problem solving under extreme pressure. Every meal was earned through skill, courage, and no small amount of luck. Every night spent sleeping was a victory in itself. But somehow, despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, they found ways to be human in the deepest sense of the word. Chapter 1: The Daily Grind. A Neanderthal's to-do list. Your alarm clock isn't the cheerful chime of your smartphone or the gentle buzz of a fitness tracker against your wrist. Instead, you're awakened by the bone-deep cold seeping through the animal hide that serves as your blanket, a thick, heavy pelt that still carries the wild scent of the creature it once protected. The cold rises from the stone floor beneath you, a persistent chill that penetrates through layers of fur and finds every gap in your makeshift bedding. The sound that pulls you from sleep isn't a snooze button you can tap, but the irritated grumbling of your uncle as he crouches by the dying embers, his weathered hands working desperately to coax life back into last night's fire. His breath creates small puffs of vapor in the frigid cave air, and you can hear the soft clicking of his teeth as he fights off shivers. Mixed with his muttering is another, more insistent alarm, the gnawing ache of hunger in your belly. A hollow sensation that has become your most reliable timekeeper. Before dawn breaks, the cave exists in a thick, almost tangible darkness. The only light comes from the fading orange glow of embers, casting dancing shadows that make the rough stone walls seem to breathe and shift. The darkness here isn't like the darkness of your modern bedroom, where digital clocks cast their soft blue glow and streetlights filter through curtains. This is a darkness so complete it has weight, pressing against your eyes and skin like black velvet. You can hear the breathing of your family members scattered around the cave deep, slow exhalations that fog in the cold air, creating a rhythm like a primitive lullaby. There's your sister's soft snore, barely audible, but comforting in its familiarity. Your father's breathing is deeper, more labored, carrying the wheeze of someone whose lungs have inhaled too much smoke over too many years. The baby makes small, contented noises, somehow warm and peaceful despite the harsh conditions that surround all of you. Your clothes, if they can be called that, are rough against your skin. The animal hide tunic you wear has stiffened overnight, the natural oils in the leather having congealed in the cold. The fur lining, once soft, now feels matted and scratchy. When you shift position, the hide makes small creaking sounds, like old leather boots being flexed after a long winter. The smell is distinctive. There's the earthy scent of the cave itself, mixed with wood smoke that has permeated everything you own. The hide carries traces of the animal it came from. along with the accumulated odors of daily life sweat, food, and the general mustiness of human habitation without running water. But your nose also picks up something more concerning: the acrid smell of smoke growing thin. The fire is dying, and with it, your family's chances of surviving another day. Fire isn't just for warmth, though warmth is desperately needed. Fire is life itself, the difference between eating and starving, between safety and becoming prey, between surviving the night and freezing to death in your sleep. Without fire, the raw meat that might feed your family becomes inedible. Without fire, the cave bears and wolves that hunt in the darkness become bold enough to investigate the scents drifting from your shelter. Without fire, the bitter cold will slow your blood, stiffen your joints, and eventually stop your heart. So your first task of the day isn't brewing coffee or checking messages on your phone. Instead, you join the quiet prayer that your uncle is offering to whatever spirits might listen, a prayer for the tiny orange embers buried beneath last night's ashes to still hold enough heat to catch new tinder. You watch as he carefully brushes away the gray ash, revealing the precious coals beneath. His movements are precise, almost ceremonial. Too much air too quickly will scatter the embers. Too little, and they'll die entirely. He leans close, so close his beard nearly touches the ash, and blows with the gentleness of someone breathing life into a newborn. The embers respond with a faint orange glow, and everyone in the cave releases a collective breath they didn't realize they were holding. Now comes the delicate work of feeding the baby flames. Dry grass first, but dry grass is a luxury in this damp world. Everything is perpetually moist from melting ice and condensation that drips constantly from the cave ceiling. The grass you've saved must be kept close to your body, warmed and dried by your own heat. It's scratchy and uncomfortable against your skin. But it's the difference between success and failure in this morning ritual. Next comes kindling thin twigs and bark shavings that have been carefully prepared and hoarded. Finding truly dry wood in this landscape is like searching for treasure. You must peel away layers of wet bark to find the dry wood inside. Split larger branches to expose their protected centers, and constantly gather and store fuel during the brief periods when the sun manages to dry things out. The fire grows slowly, fed piece by piece, with the patience of someone who understands that haste leads to failure. Each addition of fuel must be considered carefully. Too much, and you'll smother the delicate flames. Too little, and the fire will die before it can establish itself. The sweet spot requires the kind of intuitive knowledge that only comes from years of practice and the high stakes of knowing that failure means your family goes hungry and cold. As the flames finally catch and begin to dance with confidence, the cave transforms. The warm light pushes back the oppressive darkness, revealing the familiar details of your home. Shadows retreat to the corners, and the temperature begins to rise just enough to make the morning bearable. The sound of the fire, that soft crackling and popping, becomes the soundtrack to the beginning of another day of survival. But even as relief washes over you, you're already thinking ahead to tonight, when this entire process will need to be repeated. Let's take a moment to appreciate your current surroundings. You're likely in a space that's been designed for comfort walls that keep out the wind, a roof that doesn't leak, flooring that's level and dry. Perhaps there are soft furnishings around you, carefully chosen for both function and beauty. Now, forget everything you know about interior decorating. Forget about throw pillows and mood lighting, about open floor plans and feng shui. The Neanderthal approach to home design had exactly one priority: finding the corner of the cave that leaked the least. Their caves weren't the cozy, fire-lit sanctuaries you might imagine from movies. These were often damp, echoing spaces that they shared not just with their families, but with an impressive variety of insects, small rodents, and the occasional bat. Water dripped constantly from limestone ceilings, creating small pools on uneven stone floors. The walls wept moisture that collected in cracks and crevices, fostering the growth of moss and fungi that added their own earthy, musty perfume to the air. The furniture consisted of whatever rocks were flat enough to sit on, and whatever alcoves in the cave walls were deep enough to store their precious few possessions. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Families clustered together not by choice, but by necessity. Body heat was too valuable to waste on personal space. The best room in any cave was simply the spot where you could sleep without water dripping directly onto your face, and where the wind didn't cut through quite as mercilessly. Storage was equally practical. Important items, tools, dried food, extra clothing were tucked into natural crevices in the rock or buried in carefully marked spots. There were no closets, no drawers, no shelves. Everything you owned had to be portable, because the next food shortage or climate shift might force you to abandon your home with little notice. But if their interior design was purely utilitarian, their approach to fashion was, well, it was also purely utilitarian, but with a fascinating twist that would make modern fashionistas blanch. Imagine the heaviest winter coat you've ever worn. Now make it heavier. Make it stiffer. Make it smell like the wild animal it came from, mixed with wood smoke and human sweat. Remove all zippers, buttons, and clever tailoring. What you're left with is basically what passed for haute couture in the Neanderthal world. Their clothing wasn't sewn in the way we understand sewing. Instead, animal hides were carefully prepared through a process that was equal parts chemistry and endurance test. First came the scraping, using sharp stone tools to remove every bit of fat and flesh from the inside of the hide. This was back-breaking work that left your hands raw and your shoulders aching. But it was essential to prevent the hide from rotting. Next came the drying process, which could take weeks depending on the weather. The hides were stretched and held in place with wooden stakes, left to cure in whatever sun and wind were available. But here's where it gets interesting, and this might be the most remarkable fashion secret of the ancient world. Once the hide was dry, it was hard as a board, completely inflexible. Imagine trying to wear a jacket made of cardboard, and you'll get the idea. So how did they make it wearable? They chewed it. Yes, you heard that correctly. To soften the leather. Neanderthal families would spend hours, literally hours, chewing pieces of hide until their jaw muscles ached. Think about that for a moment. Picture yourself taking your favorite leather jacket and methodically chewing every square inch of it until it became pliable. It was fashion meets jaw workout, a Stone Age version of chewing gum that actually served a vital purpose. The women often did this work while performing other tasks, their jaws working steadily as they tended fires or watched children. It was a social activity, In its way, groups of women sitting together, chewing leather and sharing the gossip of the day. The rhythm of it was almost meditative chew. Pause, examine the hide, chew some more. The saliva contained enzymes that help break down the tough fibers, gradually transforming rigid animal skin into something that could bend and flex with the human body. Once softened, the hides were tied together with strips of sinew or twisted plant fibers to create basic garments. These weren't tailored to fit. They were more like wearable blankets with strategic holes cut for arms and head. Your typical Neanderthal wardrobe weighed significantly more than your body weight when wet, which it often was. The hides were thick and heavy even when dry, but when soaked by rain or snow, they became almost unbearably cumbersome. And they never really dried out completely in the damp cave environment, so there was a constant aroma of wet animal hide that permeated everything. The clothing wasn't waterproof, despite being made from animal skin. Water would gradually seep through, especially at the seams where pieces were tied together. So you faced a daily fashion dilemma that no modern person could imagine freeze to death wearing stiff but relatively dry clothing. Or freeze to death wearing soggy but slightly more flexible clothing. There were no seasonal wardrobes, no special occasion outfits, no fashion trends. You wore what you had until it literally fell apart. And then you hoped another animal would present itself so you could begin the lengthy process of creating replacement clothing. A single garment represented weeks of work and considerable risk. There's a side of Neanderthal life that rarely makes it into the dramatic retellings, the quiet times. The long stretches when hunting was impossible, when blizzards raged outside their shelters for days at a time, or when they simply had to wait for the seasonal migration of herds that might not come for weeks. These weren't vacation days or periods of leisure. These were times when survival depended on a different kind of work entirely the patient. Meticulous tasks that kept their small communities functioning. During these interludes, the cave would fill with the soft, rhythmic sounds of productivity, not the frantic energy of a hunt or the urgency of seeking shelter, but the steady, almost hypnotic rhythm of hands creating the tools that would keep them alive. The most skilled craftsmen would settle themselves near the fire, where the light was best, and begin the ancient art of stone tool-making. They worked primarily with a technique that archaeologists now call the Levallois method, a sophisticated approach to creating sharp, reliable cutting implements from carefully selected pieces of flint or obsidian. The process began with choosing the right stone. Not just any rock would do. The craftsman would examine each potential core with the concentration of a master chef selecting ingredients, running weathered fingers over the surface, tapping gently to listen to the sound the stone made, testing its density and grain. Some stones would ring with a clear, musical note when struck a sign of good internal structure. Others would produce a dull thud, indicating hidden flaws that would make them unsuitable for fine work. Once the perfect stone was selected, the real meditation began. This was Ice Age mindfulness at its purest. Each strike of the hammerstone required complete focus, absolute precision. The craftsman would hold the core in one hand, feeling its weight and balance, visualizing the tool hidden inside the raw material. The hammerstone smaller, harder, carefully shaped for the specific purpose, would rise and fall in a rhythm as old as human consciousness itself. The sound echoed gently through the cave, a percussion that marked the passage of time more reliably than any clock. Each blow was a decision point. Strike too hard, and the entire core might shatter into useless fragments, wasting hours of previous work and precious raw material. Strike too softly, and nothing would happen. The stone would remain unchanged, mocking the craftsman's efforts. But when everything went right, magic happened. Thin, sharp flakes would peel away from the core in controlled, predictable patterns. The craftsman could visualize the final tool taking shape, could feel through his hands exactly where the next strike needed to land to achieve the perfect edge, the ideal point, the precise curve that would make the difference between a successful hunt and returning home empty-handed. This was meditation disguised as necessity, concentration practice that happened to produce the technology their survival depended on. The repetitive motion, the focus required, the gentle rhythm of stone on stone, it created a kind of peaceful trance that could last for hours. Children would often fall asleep to this sound, the steady tapping becoming a lullaby that spoke of safety and preparation, while the men typically focused on stone tools and hunting implements. Other essential maintenance happened simultaneously throughout the cave. The constant wear and tear of daily life meant that something always needed repair. Animal hide clothing would develop tears from thorny bushes or sharp rocks. These had to be mended carefully, using bone needles and sinew thread, with stitches small and tight enough to keep out the cold, but not so rigid that they would tear again at the first stress. Wooden spear shafts required constant attention. The points would dull from use or break entirely during particularly violent encounters with prey. The shafts themselves would crack under pressure or warp from exposure to moisture. Each spear represented days of work finding the right wood, carving it to the proper balance and weight, fitting the stone point securely. Maintaining these weapons was like tending a garden of survival tools. But perhaps the most crucial activity during these quiet times was education. The older members of the group would gather the children around the fire and begin the process of transferring knowledge. Children learned to read the landscape like a book written in tracks and signs. An elder might draw patterns in the dirt with a charred stick, showing how to distinguish the paw print of a cave lion from that of a smaller, less dangerous predator. They would learn which plants could heal wounds and which could kill, how to predict weather changes from the behavior of birds, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes. The teaching was hands-on and immediate. A child might spend hours learning to identify the subtle differences between the droppings of various animals' knowledge that could mean the difference between tracking prey and stumbling into a predator's territory. They practiced reading the age of tracks, determining how many animals had passed, whether they were healthy or injured, moving quickly or slowly. Their classroom was the circle around the fire, and their textbooks were the accumulated wisdom of every elder who had survived long enough to share what they'd learned. The final exam was the moment when that knowledge would determine whether they could successfully track a mammoth herd. Forget about traffic jams. The biggest problem on your daily commute isn't a fender bender on the highway or a delayed subway train. Instead, picture this. You're halfway through your morning journey when you discover that the glacial river you crossed safely just last month has swollen to a raging torrent of ice-cold water and floating debris. Or perhaps you round a familiar bend in the landscape, only to find that winter's freeze-thaw cycle has opened up a crevasse that wasn't there before, a gaping crack in the earth that forces you to backtrack for miles to find a safe crossing. And then there are the traffic hazards that have teeth. A pack of hyenas has decided that your small group looks remarkably like lunch, and they're following at a distance that's far too close for comfort. Their spotted forms appearing and disappearing among the rocks like a nightmare made flesh. Welcome to Neanderthal rush hour. You are part of a nomadic people, constantly moving across a landscape that shifts with the seasons. The morning of departure begins before dawn, with the methodical process of packing everything you own onto the backs of your family members. There are no pack animals to help every horse, donkey, or ox that might make this easier is either too wild to domesticate or simply doesn't exist in this time and place. Human backs are your only option. You strap the stone tools to your belt, feeling their familiar weight settle against your hip. The precious fire-making materials, dry tinder, flint, steel pyrite are wrapped carefully in waterproof sections of animal intestine and tucked into the safest pockets of your clothing. Your sister carries the baby, a squirming bundle wrapped in the softest furs available, while also managing a pack containing the family's supply of dried meat and gathered nuts. The baby's weight shifts and changes throughout the day as he sleeps, wakes, and fusses, making every step a balancing act. Your elderly grandfather, his joints stiff with arthritis, still insists on carrying his share. There are no roads, no trail markers, no GPS devices chirping helpful directions from your pocket. Your navigation system is far more sophisticated and infinitely more fragile. It's the collective memory of your elders, passed down through generations of verbal instruction and practical demonstration. Your grandmother's memory serves as your GPS, her mind holding detailed maps of hundreds of square miles of territory, complete with seasonal variations and historical changes. She knows that the spring where your great-grandfather once found water has long since dried up, but that if you follow the dry stream bed northeast for half a day, you'll find another source. She remembers the winter when the landslide blocked the usual pass through the mountains and the alternate route that saved her family from starvation. Her knowledge is your lifeline, and every story she tells around the evening fire is potentially a survival manual for future journeys. The pace of travel is necessarily slow and deliberate. This isn't a power walk through your neighborhood or a brisk hike on a well-maintained trail. Every step must be considered, every foot placement tested for stability. The terrain is unforgiving loose rocks that can turn an ankle, hidden holes that can trap a foot, steep inclines that challenge even the strongest legs. Listen to the rhythm of your family's movement, the soft crunch of feet on gravel, the slight scuff as someone's foot slips momentarily on a smooth stone, the gentle thud of walking sticks finding purchase on firm ground. It's a percussion ensemble playing the music of migration, a steady beat that has accompanied human movement for countless generations. Your breathing creates its own rhythm as the group climbs a particularly steep section of hillside. The thin air at altitude makes every breath precious, and you can hear the soft puffing of your family members as they work their way upward. Someone ahead of you stops to rest, and the sound of heavy breathing mingles with the gentle creaking of leather packs and the soft whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. There's a meditative quality to this movement that your modern life has largely forgotten. Each step is deliberate. Each breath measured. There's no choice but to be present in the moment. A stumble could be dangerous. A wrong turn could be fatal. The rhythm becomes hypnotic step. Breathe. Step. Breathe. The soft padding of feet on stone creating a natural metronome that lulls the mind into a peaceful, focused state. The children adapt to this rhythm naturally. Their shorter legs finding a pace that matches the adults through some instinctive understanding. They learn early that complaining about tired feet or asking, "Are we there yet?" isn't just annoying, it's potentially dangerous. Energy must be conserved. Attention must be maintained, and everyone must contribute to the group's vigilance. As the day progresses, the sounds of travel create a symphony of survival, the gentle clatter of stone tools, the soft swoosh of animal hide clothing, the rhythmic footfalls, the measured breathing of people who understand that endurance is more important than speed. It's a rhythm that speaks of patience, persistence, and the ancient human ability to simply keep moving forward. One step at a time. Chapter 2. The Ice Age Menu. Not exactly 5 stars. The hunt begins in silence so complete it seems to have weight. 6 figures move across the frozen landscape like shadows, their movements coordinated through generations of practiced cooperation. They've been tracking this particular woolly mammoth for 3 days now, following the massive footprints that sink deep into the partially thawed earth, reading the story told by broken branches and scattered dung. The mammoth is old. They can tell from the way it drags one foot slightly, leaving a distinctive scrape mark beside each print. An old mammoth means one that might be slower, more vulnerable, but also more experienced in avoiding the very danger they represent. It's a calculation as delicate as any modern risk assessment. Is this animal weak enough to take down? Or wise enough to kill them? They move with patience that borders on meditation. There's no rushing in this ancient dance between predator and prey. Each step is placed carefully to avoid the crunch of frozen grass underfoot. The mammoth appears first as a dark smudge against the white landscape, then gradually resolves into the magnificent creature it is, standing nearly 12 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in coarse brown hair that hangs in thick curtains. It moves with surprising grace for something that weighs more than a modern automobile. Its curved tusks, yellowed with age and worn smooth from decades of use, catch the pale sunlight as it swings its massive head from side to side, searching for the tender shoots of vegetation buried beneath the snow. This is the moment when the hunter's heartbeats begin to synchronize with something deeper than individual courage. No one here is Rambo. No one harbors fantasies of single-handed heroics. A lone human facing a woolly mammoth has exactly one possible outcome: becoming a red stain in the snow. A cautionary tale told around future fires. This is a job that requires the kind of seamless cooperation that comes only from absolute trust and shared understanding. The eldest hunter, a woman whose scarred hands speak of decades of this dangerous work, gives the signal. Not a sound, not a word, but a subtle shift in her posture that the others read as clearly as if she'd shouted instructions. They begin to move. The approach is a choreographed piece of deadly art. 3 hunters circle wide to the left, while 2 move to the right. They're not trying to surround the mammoth. That would be impossible with such a small group. Instead, they're creating options, ensuring that no matter which direction the animal chooses to flee, someone will be in position to act. The tension builds so gradually, it's almost imperceptible, like the slow tightening of a rope. Each hunter carries a spear, tipped with a carefully crafted stone point. But these aren't weapons designed for a quick kill. The strategy relies on patience and blood loss, rather than dramatic confrontation. The goal is to inflict multiple wounds that will slowly weaken the massive creature, allowing the hunters to follow at a safe distance. The mammoth senses something. Its trunk rises, testing the air with an intelligence that gives every hunter pause. For a moment, time seems suspended. Predator and prey regard each other across the frozen landscape, two different kinds of consciousness recognizing each other's presence and purpose. Then everything happens at once, but somehow without chaos. The mammoth trumpets a sound like thunder, mixed with the scream of tearing metal, and begins to move. Not the panicked flight of a prey animal, but the deliberate, dangerous charge of a creature that has survived countless encounters with hunters just like these. The hunters scatter with practiced precision. No one freezes. No one panics. Years of training and inherited wisdom guide their movements as they flow around the charging animal like water around a stone. Spears fly, not wild throws born of desperation, but calculated launches aimed at specific targets. A spear finds its mark in the mammoth's left flank. Another strikes near the shoulder, not killing blows, but wounds that will begin the slow process of wearing down this mountain of flesh and fury. The mammoth wheels, surprisingly quick for its size, its tusks swinging in deadly arcs that could cut a human in half. One hunter too slow, too close, dives behind a boulder as a tusk crashes into the stone where his head had been moments before. The sound of ivory on rock rings across the landscape like a bell tolling. But the moment of greatest danger passes as quickly as it came. The mammoth, bleeding but far from defeated, makes the decision to flee rather than fight. It turns and lumbers away across the tundra, its wounds leaving a trail of dark spots in the snow that the hunters will follow with the patience of dedicated craftsmen. The relief that settles over the group is almost tangible. One wrong step, one moment of poor coordination, and this story would have ended very differently. But they've done their part successfully. Now begins the real work, the long, patient tracking that could take days, the careful monitoring of the animal's condition, the gradual wearing down of its strength until the final approach becomes possible. Of course, not every meal required the epic coordination of a mammoth hunt. Most days, your family's dinner table, if you can call a circle of stones around a fire a table, featured more modest fare. Think of it as the Neanderthal equivalent of weeknight cooking, practical, efficient, and focused on whatever happened to be available and catchable. Your typical protein sources were creatures that had made unfortunate evolutionary choices when it came to speed and evasion tactics. Rabbits, for instance, were abundant and nutritious, but catching them required a different kind of skill than mammoth hunting. Instead of coordinated group effort, rabbit hunting was often a solitary pursuit that demanded infinite patience and an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours at a time. You might spend an entire morning crouched behind a low shrub, your body so still that small birds would occasionally land on your shoulders, mistaking you for part of the landscape. Your breathing would slow to match the rhythm of the wind through grass. Birds presented their own challenges. They had the audacity to fly, which put them frustratingly out of reach most of the time. But Neanderthal hunters developed ingenious solutions, carefully constructed traps made from bent branches and sinew, positioned along the flight paths that birds used consistently. Patient observation revealed that even the freest creatures were surprisingly predictable in their habits, following the same routes between feeding and roosting areas day after day. But perhaps the most reliable protein source was also the most hilariously disadvantaged in the survival department. Do you know what one of their most important food sources was? Turtles? These creatures had a fatal flaw in the evolutionary arms race. They were slow, comically, tragically slow. For a hungry Neanderthal, encountering a turtle was like finding a prepackaged meal with its own built-in protective container. Picture the scene: you're walking along a riverbank, scanning for any sign of food, when you spot a turtle methodically making its way across a patch of open ground. The turtle, sensing your presence, employs its primary defense mechanism, pulling its head and legs into its shell and hoping for the best. You have to appreciate the optimism of this strategy. The turtle essentially transforms itself into a natural takeout container, complete with handle-like legs and a convenient carrying case that keeps the meat fresh. The only challenge was figuring out how to open nature's most stubborn package. This usually involved placing the turtle near the fire until the heat forced it to extend its head, at which point a quick blow with a stone tool would end its struggles. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. And a single large turtle could feed a family for a day. While the men typically focused on these hunting activities, the women and children engaged in work that was equally crucial, but required a completely different skill set gathering. This wasn't the casual berry picking of a summer afternoon stroll. This was botanical expertise that would make a modern PhD in plant biology envious. The women knew the landscape like a living library, each plant and tree containing information about nutrition, medicine, and potential danger. They could identify dozens of species of edible roots, nuts, and berries. But more importantly, they knew when and where to find them. Hazelnuts hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves, wild onions whose locations were remembered from previous years, berries that wouldn't ripen for another month, but whose leaves could be eaten now. Their knowledge went far beyond simple identification. They understood the subtle differences between plants that looked nearly identical but had vastly different properties. The root that would provide essential calories and the one that would cause violent stomach cramps often grew side by side, distinguished only by minor variations in leaf shape or the precise way the stem attached to the ground. This botanical expertise was literally a matter of life and death. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could help stop bleeding from wounds, and which could ease the pain of childbirth. The teaching of this knowledge was ongoing and comprehensive. Children learned through constant observation and carefully supervised practice. A mother might spend an entire afternoon showing her daughter the difference between two similar-looking plants, emphasizing the tiny details that could save or end a life. The lessons were repeated season after season until the knowledge became as automatic as breathing. The gathering work itself was methodical and thorough. A foraging expedition might cover miles of territory, with each woman carrying woven baskets or leather pouches to collect the day's harvest. They worked with the efficiency of experienced farmers, knowing exactly which areas would be most productive at different times of year. The rhythm of gathering was meditative in its own way, the soft rustle of hands searching through undergrowth, the gentle snap of stems being harvested, the quiet conversation between women, sharing knowledge and observations. Children learned to move quietly through this natural pantry, understanding that patience and attention to detail were more valuable than speed or strength. There were times when the carefully planned hunts failed, when the gathering expeditions returned with empty baskets, when the seasonal migrations didn't arrive on schedule. These were the times that tested not just physical endurance, but the very boundaries of what it meant to be human. When hunger became a constant companion that gnawed at the belly and clouded the mind. The Neanderthals faced choices that no creature should have to make. Sometimes, dinner wasn't something they hunted themselves. Instead, it was leftovers from someone else's successful hunt, and that someone else might be a cave lion whose table manners were far more violent than anything humans could muster. The art of scavenging required a delicate balance of courage and caution that would challenge even the most experienced modern risk-takers. Picture the scene: the family has gone 3 days without a substantial meal. The children's faces have taken on the hollow-eyed look that comes with genuine hunger, and the adults move with the careful economy of motion that conserves precious energy. Following that scent could lead to salvation or death, often both possibilities existing within the same dangerous opportunity. A pride of cave lions might have successfully brought down a massive bison, eaten their fill, and retreated to digest their meal in the safety of dense brush. What remained could feed a Neanderthal family for days if they could claim it before other scavengers arrived, and if the original hunters didn't return to defend their prize. The approach required the stealth of expert thieves combined with the quick decision-making of emergency room doctors. They had to assess the scene instantly. How fresh was the kill? Were the predators truly gone, or merely resting nearby? What other scavengers were already competing for the same prize? Hyenas were particularly dangerous competitors. Not only did they travel in packs, but they were perfectly willing to view humans as either competition to be driven away or additional protein to be added to their meal. The work itself was frantic and methodical at the same time. When even scavenging failed to provide enough meat, the Neanderthals turned to a resource that other scavengers often overlooked: the bones themselves. Hidden inside the long bones of large animals was a treasure more valuable than any precious metal: bone marrow, rich with fats and nutrients that could sustain life when nothing else was available. The sound of this desperate feast was distinctive and rhythmic, the sharp crack of stone hammers against thick bone, repeated with the persistence of a woodpecker attacking a particularly stubborn tree. Crack, crack, crack. The percussion echoed through the cave as family members took turns wielding heavy stone tools against femurs and humeri that were often as thick as a modern baseball bat. This wasn't delicate work. The bones were designed by nature to withstand enormous stresses, and breaking them open required both technique and brute force. The person wielding the hammerstone had to strike with precision too gentle, and the bone would merely dent, too forceful in the wrong place, and the precious marrow inside would be contaminated. When successful, the reward was a semi-liquid treasure that looked unappetizing but provided essential calories and nutrients. The marrow was scooped out with thin bone tools or simply sucked directly from the cracked bones. It had a rich, fatty taste that probably fell somewhere between butter and liver, not pleasant by modern standards. but ambrosia to people whose bodies were consuming their own muscle tissue for fuel. The entire family participated in this bone-cracking enterprise. Children, too small to wield the heavy hammers, learned to hold bones steady or to extract marrow with small, delicate tools. The elderly contributed by identifying which bones would yield the most marrow and teaching the proper techniques for efficient extraction. It was a family activity born of desperation, but it built bonds through shared effort and mutual dependence. There came times when even the bones yielded no more sustenance, when every scrap of meat had been consumed and every source of plant nutrition had been exhausted. These were the moments when starvation ceased to be a distant threat and became an immediate reality. This was not evil. This was not the savagery that popular imagination might suggest. This was the endpoint of options, the place where the brutal mathematics of survival override every other consideration. When your children are dying of hunger, when their bodies are consuming themselves from the inside out, when a member of your small group has succumbed to the cold or injury, the cruel logic of survival begins to speak in a voice that drowns out everything else. The archaeological evidence tells this story without judgment or sensationalism. Cut marks on human bones found in Neanderthal sites speak of careful butchering techniques applied to human remains. These are not the random hack marks of violence or the bite marks of predation. They are the methodical cuts of people who understood anatomy, who approached even this last resort with the same careful technique they applied to processing any other source of nutrition. The decision was never made lightly. These were people who cared for their disabled members, who provided for the elderly long past their productive years. Imagine the weight of such a decision. The person who had died might have been a brother, a sister, a grandparent who had taught essential survival skills. They had been loved, valued, and mourned. But love and sentiment become luxuries when the alternative is watching the living members of your family waste away before your eyes. The process itself was probably conducted with the same ritualistic care that marked other important activities in their lives. The cutting was done with sharp stone tools, the same implements used for processing any large animal. The meat was likely cooked thoroughly, both for safety and perhaps to psychologically distance the act from its reality. The bones were treated with the same respect given to any source of nutrition cracked for marrow, processed completely, wasted not at all. This was survival distilled to its most essential form, humanity tested at its very limits. It wasn't cruelty or barbarism. It was the tragic mathematics of existence in a world that offered no safety net, no backup plan, no alternatives when all else failed. You've probably stood in front of your refrigerator on a Sunday evening, planning meals for the week ahead, confident that your leftovers will keep safely until you're ready to reheat them. Your freezer holds months' worth of food, preserved at a steady temperature that prevents spoilage and keeps nutrients intact. Now imagine facing the same challenge without any of these modern conveniences. When your hunting group successfully brings down a large animal, let's say a reindeer, that weighs more than 3 people combined, you suddenly have more meat than your family can consume in several days. But you have no refrigeration, no vacuum-sealed containers, no preservatives. You have perhaps 24 hours before that precious protein begins to spoil. Your solution requires the same kind of innovative thinking that modern food scientists apply to preservation, but using only the materials that nature provides. The most reliable method is also the most labor-intensive, cutting the meat into thin strips and laying them out on flat rocks to dry in the sun and wind. Picture the careful choreography of this process. Every usable surface around your camp becomes a drying rack. Flat stones are cleaned meticulously and positioned to catch the maximum amount of sunlight. The meat is sliced with stone knives into strips no thicker than your finger, each cut made with the precision of someone who understands that uneven thickness means uneven drying, and uneven drying means potential rot. The strips are laid out in neat rows, with careful spacing to ensure air circulation around each piece. This isn't a task you can start and then ignore. The meat must be turned regularly, checked constantly for signs of spoilage, and protected from the flies and other insects that view your food preparation as their own personal buffet. When the weather cooperates, this method produces a kind of prehistoric jerky that can last for months. The dried meat becomes tough and chewy, requiring considerable jaw work to consume, but it retains most of its nutritional value and provides portable protein for long journeys. But weather doesn't always cooperate, and sometimes you need a more reliable preservation method. Enter nature's refrigerator permafrost. In areas where the ground remains frozen year-round, your ancestors discovered they could create underground storage chambers that would keep meat fresh for extended periods. The process of digging these caches was backbreaking work, using stone tools to chip through frozen earth hard as concrete, but the result was a natural freezer that required no electricity and never broke down. The meat was wrapped carefully in animal hides and lowered into these frozen chambers, then covered with stones and marked with landmarks that could be found again months later. Entire carcasses could be stored this way, providing insurance against the lean months when hunting was impossible and gathered foods were scarce. Smoking provided another preservation option, though it required constant attention and considerable fuel. A smoking rack was constructed from green branches that wouldn't burn easily, positioned over a fire that was kept deliberately low and smoky rather than hot and clean. When it came time to actually cook your preserved or fresh meat, your options were refreshingly simple, if not exactly sophisticated. Most meat was roasted directly over the fire, held on wooden spits that required constant turning to ensure even cooking. But perhaps the most ingenious cooking method they developed was what archaeologists call stone boiling. Imagine you want to make soup, but you have no metal pots, no ceramic vessels that can withstand direct heat. Your cooking container is made from animal hide, essentially a leather bag that would burn instantly if placed over a fire. The solution requires a leap of culinary imagination that borders on genius. You fill your leather cooking bag with water and whatever ingredients you want to cook. Then you heat stones in your fire until they're literally glowing hot. Using wooden tongs or bone implements, you carefully transfer these superheated rocks into your leather pot. The result is instant, vigorous boiling. The hot stones heat the water to cooking temperature while the leather remains safely away from the flames. As the stones cool, you replace them with fresh hot ones, maintaining the cooking temperature for as long as needed. It's primitive sous vide cooking, a precisely controlled water bath that can gently cook tough meat until it becomes tender enough to eat. Think about that for a moment. You're making soup by throwing rocks into a bag. It's the kind of technique that sounds completely insane until you realize it actually works perfectly, requiring only materials that are available anywhere humans can build a fire. The flavors that resulted from these cooking methods were distinctive. Everything carried the taste of smoke. Since smoke was an unavoidable part of nearly every cooking process, your meat often had hints of ash mixed in, not intentionally, but because keeping wood ash completely separated from food was essentially impossible when your kitchen was a circle of stones around an open fire. Chapter 3. Awkward Family Gatherings. Neanderthal Social Life. The family structure of a Neanderthal group would have made modern genealogists throw up their hands in despair. Forget the tidy nuclear family of mom, dad, and 2.5 children living in their own separate household with a white picket fence. What gathered around the evening fire was more like a complex web of relationships that would challenge even the most sophisticated social networking software. Picture an extended family that includes not just parents and children, but uncles and aunts, cousins of various degrees, grandparents, if they were lucky enough to still be alive, and a few individuals whose exact relationship to everyone else was, well, it was complicated. Maybe they were distant cousins. Maybe they were refugees from another group that had been absorbed through marriage or disaster. Maybe they were just people who had proven useful enough to stick around and had gradually become part of the fabric of the family through shared survival. The result was a group of 15 to 30 individuals who knew each other's habits, quirks, and annoying personal characteristics with the intimate detail that comes from never, ever being able to get away from each other. Imagine being quarantined with your entire extended family not for 2 weeks, not for 2 months, but for 20 years. That was essentially their entire social existence. The cave that served as their shelter was like a one-room apartment shared by people who had no choice but to live together. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. Every conversation was overheard. Every argument became everyone's business. Every personal habit, pleasant or otherwise, was on display for the entire group. The teenage cousin who snored loudly, the elderly uncle whose digestion made embarrassing noises, the aunt who had strong opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. All of these personalities were compressed into a space barely larger than a modern living room. The potential for conflict was enormous and constant. Resources were always limited, which meant every decision about distribution became a potential source of tension. Who got the choicest piece of meat from tonight's successful hunt? Who claimed the driest, warmest spot in the cave when the winter winds howled outside? Who was responsible when someone's favorite spear, point the one that had been carefully crafted over several days and had proven lucky in previous hunts, mysteriously turned up broken? These weren't abstract philosophical disputes about fairness and justice. These were arguments about survival, where being shortchanged on food might mean weakness that could lead to death, where sleeping in the damp corner of the cave might result in illness that the group couldn't afford to treat. Every disagreement carried weight that modern family squabbles simply don't possess. The children added their own layer of complexity to group dynamics. Unlike modern kids who disappear into their rooms or escape to friends' houses when family tensions rise, Neanderthal children were always present, always underfoot. But perhaps most challenging of all was the complete absence of personal space or individual choice. When the group decided to move to follow migrating herds, everyone moved, no exceptions, no alternatives, no opting out. When resources were scarce and rationing became necessary, individual preferences became irrelevant. when someone in the group made a decision that affected everyone's safety. There was no democratic process, no committee meetings, no appeals process. The elderly members of the group presented both challenges and invaluable resources. Their accumulated knowledge was literally priceless. They were the living libraries of survival information that could mean the difference between life and death. But they also required care and resources during times when every calorie was precious. The decision of how much food to give to a grandmother whose arthritis made her unable to contribute to hunting was both a moral choice and a survival calculation. Yet somehow, despite all these pressures and potential sources of conflict, these groups not only functioned, but thrived for thousands of generations. The secret was the absolute interdependence that made every individual essential to the group's survival. They might irritate each other. They might argue over resources. They might harbor grudges and resentments that simmered for years, but they would fight to the death to protect each other. Because alone, any individual was essentially a meal waiting to happen. A single person, no matter how skilled or strong, couldn't maintain a fire, hunt large game, process food, create tools, and defend against predators simultaneously. The group wasn't just a social convenience, it was the fundamental unit of survival. This created a fascinating dynamic where personal conflicts had to be balanced against collective necessity. You might be furious with your brother for eating more than his share of the dried meat, but when a pack of wolves approached the camp, that same brother became your most trusted ally. You might find your sister-in-law's constant chatter unbearably annoying, but her knowledge of which plants could treat infections made her invaluable to the group's well-being. The romantic landscape of the Ice Age presented challenges that would make modern dating apps seem like the height of convenience and variety. Imagine opening your preferred dating platform and discovering that your only options are people you've known since birth, most of whom are related to you in ways that would make any potential relationship both socially awkward and genetically inadvisable. This was the fundamental problem facing every young Neanderthal reaching reproductive age. The gene pool of any single group was necessarily small and interconnected. Everyone knew everyone else's family history going back several generations, which meant that finding a suitable partner who wasn't your cousin, your aunt's stepchild, or your brother's ex-girlfriend required looking well beyond the familiar faces around the evening fire. The genetic evidence tells us that Neanderthal groups did indeed exchange members, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of the problems that arise from too much intermarriage within small populations. But facilitating these exchanges required logistics that would challenge even the most determined modern matchmaker. This was not a matter of swiping right on an attractive profile and meeting for coffee at a convenient location. This was a 50-kilometer trek across frozen tundra, carrying all your possessions on your back, with the hope that you might encounter another group of humans who would be willing to engage in social interaction rather than treating you as competitors for scarce resources or potential threats to their territory. The journey itself was an act of considerable faith. Your group would have to spare several of their strongest, most capable members for what might be a weeks-long expedition. These were people who couldn't afford to be away from hunting, gathering, and the daily work of survival. When two groups finally encountered each other, the initial interactions probably resembled a cross between a diplomatic summit and a very awkward middle school dance. Both sides would approach with extreme caution, weapons within easy reach, but not overtly threatening, eyes constantly scanning for signs of hostile intent, while simultaneously trying to appear friendly and non-threatening themselves. The negotiations that followed were delicate affairs involving multiple levels of exchange. Tools and raw materials might change hands, first a gesture of good faith that demonstrated each group's skills and resources. Information was equally valuable: which areas had the best hunting, where fresh water could be found, which routes were safe, and which should be avoided. These exchanges built trust gradually, creating the foundation for more personal interactions. But perhaps most importantly, they provided opportunities for the young adults of both groups to size each other up as potential partners. This assessment process had to happen under the watchful eyes of protective family members, within the context of intergroup diplomacy, and with the understanding that any romantic attachments formed might require one person to permanently leave their birth family to join their partner's group. The criteria for attractiveness in this context were refreshingly practical. Physical beauty, while probably not irrelevant, took a backseat to more immediate concerns about survival and reproductive fitness. Strong teeth were essential, not just for the obvious aesthetic reasons. Perhaps most importantly, potential partners needed to demonstrate that they weren't suffering from any of the various ailments that could spell doom for themselves and their future families. Not coughing up blood was a basic minimum requirement, indicating the absence of respiratory diseases that could be both contagious and fatal. Clear eyes, steady hands, and the ability to participate fully in the demanding physical work of daily survival were far more important than any abstract notion of beauty. The courtship process itself was probably a fascinating blend of individual attraction and group negotiation. Young people might find themselves drawn to someone from the other group, but their families would need to approve not just the match, but the complex logistics of making it work. Would the bride or groom relocate? What skills and knowledge would they bring to their new family? How would the loss of that person affect their birth group's survival prospects? These romantic decisions carried weight that modern relationships rarely bear. Their standards may have been practical, their options limited, and their courtship process complicated by survival requirements. But they were still humans seeking connection, companionship, and the continuation of their genetic legacy. In that respect, they faced exactly the same fundamental challenges that modern humans navigate, just with significantly higher stakes and considerably fewer backup plans. The relationship between different Neanderthal groups was as complex and varied as any neighborhood dynamics you might observe today, but with stakes that were considerably higher than disputes over property lines or noise complaints. These were relationships that could determine whether your family ate or starved, whether you survived the winter or perished in the cold, whether your children grew up or became footnotes in the endless struggle for survival. Some neighboring groups maintained relationships that were cautiously cooperative. Archaeological evidence suggests extensive trading networks that moved high-quality flint and other precious materials across hundreds of miles. But cooperation wasn't the only form of intergroup relationship. The archaeological record also tells darker stories, written in the language of healed fractures and cut marks on ancient bones. Some Neanderthal remains show clear evidence of violence inflicted by other humans, not the random injuries that might result from hunting accidents or encounters with predators, but deliberate trauma that speaks of conflict between groups competing for the same scarce resources. These conflicts were probably brief but brutal affairs. When two groups encountered each other in territory that both considered essential for their survival, negotiations might quickly escalate to violence. A water source during a drought, a sheltered valley during harsh weather, or the migration route of an important prey species could become the focal point of disputes that left lasting marks on the participants, those who survived. Anyway, the violence, when it occurred, was intensely personal and immediate. This wasn't the distant technological warfare of modern conflicts, but hand-to-hand combat with stone weapons that required fighters to look into each other's eyes. And then, one day, everything changed. New neighbors moved into the area, neighbors who were taller, leaner, and carried tools that seemed almost impossibly sophisticated by Neanderthal standards. These newcomers had straight, slender spear points that were perfectly symmetrical, jewelry made from shells that could only have come from distant oceans. And most remarkably, they seemed to create art for no practical purpose whatsoever. The arrival of Homo sapiens. Modern humans in Neanderthal territory marked the beginning of one of the most fascinating and consequential meetings in human history. These weren't just new neighbors. They were an entirely different kind of human, with different approaches to survival, different social structures, and different ways of understanding and manipulating their environment. The initial encounters between these two human species must have been extraordinary, moments of mutual assessment. Picture the scene: a Neanderthal hunting party cresting a ridge and spotting smoke from an unknown fire in the valley below. As they approach cautiously, they discover a group of humans who are clearly not from any familiar neighboring group. These strangers are built differently, taller and more slender, with prominent chins and high foreheads that give their faces an unfamiliar appearance. But more striking than their physical differences are their possessions. Their tools show a level of craftsmanship that seems almost magical. Their clothing is more sophisticated, made from materials and using techniques that the Neanderthals have never seen. They carry objects that appear to have no practical function, decorative items that suggest a kind of thinking about the world that goes beyond immediate survival needs. The interaction that followed was probably a mixture of curiosity, caution, and calculation. Both groups would have been sizing each other up as potential threats, potential allies, or potential sources of useful knowledge and materials. The Neanderthals might have been impressed by the newcomers' technology, while the modern humans might have been struck by the Neanderthals' obvious adaptation to the harsh northern climate and their intimate knowledge of local conditions. But what actually happened was far more interesting and complex than any of these simple scenarios. The evidence suggests that the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans involved all of these possibilities at different times and places. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they traded. Sometimes they maintained wary distance. But most remarkably, sometimes they formed relationships that were far more intimate than mere diplomacy or commerce. These encounters weren't just about conflict or cooperation. There were moments that were more personal, times when the boundaries between groups became permeable, when individual relationships transcended species differences, when the fundamental human drives for companionship and connection overcame the barriers of physical difference and cultural unfamiliarity. The evidence for these intimate encounters isn't found in ancient cave paintings or archaeological artifacts. Instead, it's written in the most permanent record of all the genetic code that still exists today. Modern DNA analysis has revealed that most people of European and Asian descent carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes in their chromosomes. This revelation transforms our understanding of these ancient encounters. The Neanderthals didn't simply vanish from history, replaced by technologically superior modern humans. Instead, they became part of us, contributing their genetic heritage to the human population that would eventually spread across the globe. In a very real sense, the Neanderthals never went extinct. They merged with our own species, and their descendants are sitting in coffee shops, driving cars, and reading stories about their ancestors today. That slightly stronger immune system that helps you fight off infections, that might be your Neanderthal heritage. The way your body processes certain foods, or your tolerance for cold weather, or even some aspects of your sleep patterns. All of these could be gifts from ancestors who lived in caves and hunted mammoths with stone-tipped spears. The neighborhood dynamics of the Ice Age, it turns out, were far more complex and consequential than anyone could have imagined. In the depths of caves scattered across Spain, something remarkable happened that had nothing to do with survival, nothing to do with finding food or staying warm or avoiding predators. In the flickering light of animal fat lamps, Neanderthal hands reached out and touched cave walls, leaving marks that served no practical purpose whatsoever. These weren't instructions for hunting, or maps showing water sources, or warnings about dangerous animals. They were simply there. Picture yourself standing in one of these ancient galleries, your modern flashlight revealing what their primitive lamps once illuminated. The artwork isn't what you might expect from humanity's first creative expression. There are no elaborate hunting scenes, no detailed portraits of family members, no complex symbolic representations of their beliefs or experiences. Instead, you see something far more fundamental and mysteriously moving dots, lines, and the outlines of hands. The hand stencils are perhaps the most haunting. A Neanderthal artist would place their hand flat against the stone wall and blow pigment around it. They were saying, "I was here." They were leaving proof of their existence in a world that seemed determined to erase all evidence of their passage. In an environment where every human achievement, every successful hunt, every survived winter, every child raised to adulthood was temporary and fragile, these simple marks on stone were their attempt at permanence. Think about the audacity of that impulse. Here were people whose every waking moment was devoted to the demanding work of staying alive. Yet they chose to spend precious time and resources creating something that had no survival value. They gathered materials to make pigments, fashioned primitive brushes, and devoted energy to an activity that fed no one, protected no one, and contributed nothing to the group's immediate welfare. Yet they did it anyway, driven by something that was purely, recognizably human: the need to create, to express, to leave a mark that said their consciousness had touched this place and found it worthy of decoration. Their artistic impulses extended beyond cave walls to personal adornment that reveals an aesthetic sense that was both practical and surprisingly sophisticated. Neanderthal archaeological sites have yielded jewelry made from eagle talons and seashells, carefully perforated and shaped for wearing. These weren't random collections of pretty objects, but deliberately chosen materials that required considerable effort to obtain and prepare. Eagle talons, in particular, represent a fascinating choice for personal decoration. Eagles were dangerous birds of prey that were difficult to hunt and potentially lethal to approach. Yet Neanderthals went to the trouble of obtaining their talons specifically for decorative purposes. The talons were cleaned, polished, and pierced with holes that would allow them to be strung together or attached to clothing. This suggests not just an appreciation for beauty, but a willingness to take risks and invest labor for purely aesthetic purposes. The seashells tell an even more remarkable story. Many were found hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean, indicating either these Neanderthal groups traveled extraordinary distances for decorative materials. Listen. In the silence of the cave, you might hear something that transcends the simple rhythm of survival. A simple melody, repetitive and haunting, drifting through the stone corridors like a ghost of sound from 60,000 years ago. This is the voice of the first music, the earliest song our species ever sang. The bone flute is perhaps the most moving artifact of Neanderthal creativity. Fashioned from the hollow leg bone of a cave bear, carefully pierced with holes that created a scale of musical notes. It represents a leap of imagination that takes your breath away. Someone looked at a piece of bone and envisioned not just a tool for practical use, but an instrument capable of creating beauty from controlled breath and fingered holes. The creation of this instrument required sophisticated understanding of acoustics, careful measurement of hole placement, and considerable skill in working with bone. But more than technical expertise, it required something ineffable, the recognition that organized sound could create pleasure, emotion, and meaning beyond words. Imagine the first Neanderthal musician, perhaps during the long, dark hours of winter confinement, lifting this bone tube to their lips and discovering that breath could become melody. The sound would have filled the cave with something entirely new in human experience, music created intentionally, for no purpose other than the joy and wonder of organized sound. The melodies they played are lost to us forever, but the impulse that created them is eternal and instantly recognizable. In those simple, repetitive notes, we hear the birth of human creativity, the first stirrings of the artistic consciousness that would eventually produce symphonies and operas and jazz and rock and roll. This was sound created not for survival, but simply for existence, not to communicate practical information, but to express something deeper emotion, perhaps, or spiritual longing, or simply the discovery that humans could impose order and beauty on the chaos of their harsh world. The music has faded, but the silence that follows still vibrates with the echo of humanity's first song. Chapter 4. An ache in the bones. Health, wellness, and the first doctors. Your modern healthcare plan probably includes options for preventive care, emergency treatment, prescription medications, and specialist consultations. You carry insurance cards that guarantee access to hospitals equipped with imaging technology, surgical suites, and pharmacies stocked with thousands of different medications. The Neanderthal healthcare plan was considerably more straightforward. Don't get sick. Don't get hurt. And if you do get sick or hurt, try very hard not to die. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one available in a world where the nearest emergency room was about 60,000 years in the future. Daily life presented a constant parade of potential health catastrophes that would barely register as concerns in your safe modern world. A simple stumble over uneven ground could result in a sprained ankle that would leave you unable to keep up with your nomadic family. A cut from a sharp stone tool might seem minor until infection set in, but perhaps no health crisis was more common or more potentially devastating than broken bones. In a world where your livelihood depended on your ability to walk long distances, carry heavy loads, and perform the physically demanding work of survival, a fractured limb wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. Imagine you're crossing a rocky riverbed when your foot catches between two stones and you hear the unmistakable crack that means your leg has just broken. In your modern life, this would mean a call to emergency services, a trip to the hospital, x-rays, proper setting of the bone, a cast, pain medication, and crutches. Your Neanderthal treatment plan would be significantly different. Step 1. Lie very still and try not to scream, because loud noises might attract predators. Step 2. Hope that your family members are feeling generous enough to carry you to shelter and willing to share their food with someone who can no longer contribute. Step 3. Wait, possibly for months. For the bone to heal on its own, the healing process itself was entirely dependent on your body's natural ability to repair damage. There were no antibiotics to prevent infection, no painkillers to ease the constant ache, no physical therapy to restore full function. Some broken bones healed reasonably well, leaving their owners with only minor limitations. Others healed poorly, creating permanent disabilities that affected mobility for the rest of the person's life. And some never healed at all, leading to infections, complications, and eventually death. But if broken bones were bad, infections were worse. A small cut on your hand could escalate into a life-threatening crisis within days. Without antiseptic solutions or sterile dressings, even tiny wounds provided entry points for bacteria that could overwhelm your immune system. The progression was grimly predictable. First, the wound would become red and swollen, then discharge pus. Then red streaks would appear on your skin as the infection spread. Your body would develop a fever as you grew weak and delirious. Perhaps most agonizing of all were dental problems. Toothaches were genuine nightmares in a world without dentists, without Novocaine, without any form of effective pain relief. When a tooth became infected or developed a painful cavity, your options were extremely limited. Endure the constant, throbbing pain that made eating, sleeping, and concentrating impossible. Or ask someone to help you solve the problem with a stone hammer. The fossil evidence shows that dental disease was common among Neanderthals. Their teeth display cavities, abscesses, and wear patterns that indicate both poor dental hygiene and the consumption of foods that were hard on tooth enamel. Some skulls show clear evidence of teeth that were deliberately removed, probably by striking them with stone tools until they broke away from the jaw. Imagine the desperation required to choose that solution. The pain of an infected tooth must have been so unbearable that the trauma of having it knocked out with a rock seemed preferable. And unlike modern dental extraction, this primitive dentistry offered no anesthesia and no sterile conditions. Against the backdrop of constant struggle and survival challenges that defined Neanderthal life, there exists evidence of something that transcends mere survival instinct. something that speaks to the deepest, most essentially human qualities that these ancient people possessed. In the Shanidar cave of northern Iraq, researchers uncovered the remains of a man they designated Shanidar I, whose bones tell a story that should be impossible according to the harsh logic of prehistoric survival. This individual lived with disabilities that would have made him completely dependent on his community for every basic need. He was blind in his left eye, had never developed full use of his right arm, and walked with a severe limp that would have made him incapable of participating in hunts, long-distance travel, or any of the physically demanding work that kept Neanderthal groups alive. By every rational calculation of survival economics, this man should have died in childhood or early adolescence, in a world where every calorie was precious, where every member of the group needed to contribute their labor to the collective effort of staying alive. But Shanidar I didn't die young. The evidence from his bones indicates that he lived to be approximately 40 years old, ancient by Neanderthal standards, an age that represented a full lifetime of experience and accumulated wisdom. He survived not just his initial disabilities, but decades of harsh winters, food shortages, and all the dangers that claimed the lives of healthier, stronger individuals. How was this possible? The answer lies not in his physical capabilities, but in the choices made by the people around him. Someone fed him when he couldn't hunt for himself. Someone protected him when he couldn't defend himself. Someone carried his possessions when the group needed to move to new territory. Someone valued his life more than the burden his care represented, day after day, year after year, for decades. In a society where every decision was a matter of life and death, the people of Shanidar I's community made a conscious, repeated choice to keep him alive and cared for. This wasn't an isolated case of extraordinary compassion. In the cave site of La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, archaeologists discovered the remains of another elderly Neanderthal man whose bones tell an equally moving story of communal care. This individual suffered from severe arthritis that would have made movement painful and difficult. His spine was curved and stiff. His hip joints were deteriorated, and most tellingly, he had lost most of his teeth. In a world without blenders, food processors, or even basic cooking techniques that could adequately soften tough meat and fibrous plant material, the loss of teeth should have been a death sentence. Unable to properly chew the coarse foods that made up the Neanderthal diet, this man should have slowly starved, his body unable to extract sufficient nutrition from whatever he could manage to swallow. But examination of his jawbones reveals that he lived for a considerable time after losing his teeth. His gums had healed over, indicating that he survived months or even years in this condition. The only way this would have been possible is if someone else was preparing his food for him, pre-chewing tough meat until it was soft enough for him to swallow, mashing gathered plant foods into a paste he could consume without teeth. Picture this act of devotion, someone in his family or group sitting by the fire each evening, methodically chewing portions of the day's hard-won food until it was soft enough for the old man to eat, then transferring this pre-digested meal to him. By modern standards of hygiene, this seems unsanitary, almost revolting. But by the standards of human compassion, it represents love in its purest form, the willingness to sacrifice personal comfort and dignity to ensure that a vulnerable member of the community continued to live. These fossil stories provide the most powerful evidence we have of Neanderthal humanity. They demonstrate that these ancient people possessed moral sense that went far beyond simple survival instinct. They cared for individuals who offered no practical benefit to the group. This evidence contradicts every stereotype about primitive humans being brutal, callous, or governed purely by survival instincts. Instead, it reveals people who understood concepts like loyalty, family obligation, and the intrinsic value of individual life. They developed social structures that prioritized care for the vulnerable alongside the practical necessities of survival. The care provided to these disabled individuals wasn't just physical, it was emotional and social as well. These people remained part of their communities, participating in whatever ways they could, contributing their knowledge and experience even when they could no longer contribute their labor. They were valued for who they were, not just what they could do. In the gentle attention given to feeding the toothless elder, in the daily assistance provided to the disabled hunter, we see the birth of human compassion. These weren't people who had the luxury of being kind. They were people who chose kindness despite having every practical reason to make harsher choices. Modern science has given us a remarkable window into the daily lives of our ancient relatives through the most unlikely of sources, the fossilized dental plaque that still clings to Neanderthal teeth after tens of thousands of years. This microscopic time capsule, preserved in the tartar that accumulated on their molars, contains a detailed record of everything they put in their mouths. The analysis reveals something extraordinary. These ancient people were systematically consuming plants that we now know possess powerful medicinal properties. Embedded in their dental calculus are the microscopic remains of willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient that would eventually be synthesized into aspirin. They were also consuming chamomile flowers, which have natural anti-inflammatory and calming properties. But perhaps most remarkable of all, the dental plaque contains traces of penicillium mold, the same fungus from which Alexander Fleming would derive penicillin in 1928, earning him a Nobel Prize for discovering what he thought was the world's first antibiotic. They may not have understood the concept of antibiotics, but they had somehow figured out that consuming certain molds could help fight infections and heal wounds. They were, in essence, the world's first pharmacists. And their pharmacy was an entire forest filled with natural remedies that they had learned to identify, harvest, and use with sophisticated precision. Consider the implications of this discovery. This represents deliberate, systematic use of natural medicines based on accumulated knowledge about which plants provided relief from pain, infection, and illness. The forest around their caves wasn't just a source of food and materials. It was a living medicine cabinet that they had learned to navigate with the expertise of trained botanists. They knew which trees to strip bark from when someone was suffering from pain and fever. They understood which flowers could calm an anxious mind or settle an upset stomach. They had identified which fungi could help fight the infections that constantly threatened their survival. This knowledge wasn't discovered overnight. It represents thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and the gradual accumulation of medical wisdom passed down through generations. Imagine the courage, or perhaps desperation, of the first Neanderthal who decided to taste that interesting-looking plant when nothing else had helped their sick child. The learning process would have been slow, dangerous, and sometimes tragic. For every plant that provided relief, there were probably others that caused illness or death. Spare a moment of sympathy for the first Neanderthal who decided to experiment with that interesting-looking mushroom or unfamiliar berry. The sophistication of their botanical knowledge becomes even more impressive when you consider the complexity of proper plant identification. Many medicinal plants look remarkably similar to toxic varieties. The difference between a healing remedy and a deadly poison might be as subtle as the shape of a leaf or the pattern of veins on a flower petal. The evidence suggests they had mastered these subtleties through generations of careful observation and knowledge transfer. Elderly members of the group would have served as living libraries of medicinal knowledge, teaching younger family members not just which plants to use, but when to find them, how to prepare them, and what dosages were safe and effective. Their approach to medicine was holistic in ways that modern healthcare is only beginning to rediscover. They understood that treating illness required not just addressing symptoms, but supporting the body's overall ability to heal itself. The plants they chose provided not just pain relief or infection-fighting properties, but also nutrients and compounds that supported immune function and general health. The integration of medicine into their daily lives was seamless and constant. They didn't wait until someone became seriously ill to begin treatment. They incorporated medicinal plants into their regular diet as preventive medicine. And so we come to the end of their story. Though like all the best endings, this one isn't really an ending at all. The Neanderthals didn't vanish in some dramatic catastrophe or sudden extinction event. Their disappearance was gentler than that, more like a slow fade than a final curtain. Over thousands of years, as the climate shifted and new neighbors arrived with different technologies and strategies, the distinct Neanderthal way of life gradually blended into something new. But here's the beautiful truth that modern science has revealed: they didn't really disappear at all. A part of them is still here, right now, in you, in me, woven into the very fabric of our genetic code. That slightly stronger immune system that helps you fight off winter colds, that might be your Neanderthal heritage speaking. Their DNA flows through approximately 60% of modern humans, a genetic legacy that connects us directly to these remarkable people. In the most literal sense, they live on in us. Their lives were brutal, noisy, and filled with constant anxiety about survival. Every day brought new dangers, new challenges, new reasons to worry about whether they would see another sunrise. But now, as we reach the end of their tale, all of that struggle has fallen silent. Their story has found its rest. And your space, the space you're occupying right now, is so perfectly, wonderfully different from theirs. It's quiet, where theirs was chaotic. It's safe, where theirs was dangerous. It's warm and comfortable, where theirs was cold and unforgiving. Feel the contrast in your bones, in your muscles, in your peaceful, steady breathing. Let the images we've shared tonight begin to fade into something dreamlike and distant, those frozen grasslands stretching endlessly under ancient skies, the warm glow of fires that meant the difference between life and death, the haunting melodies of bone flutes drifting through limestone caves where families huddled together. Allow these visions to become gentle and soothing now, like memories of a movie you watched long ago. Let them settle into the quiet corners of your mind as you sink deeper into the luxury of your modern comfort, your soft bed, your climate-controlled room, your absolute safety from predators and storms, and the thousand dangers that once made sleep a vulnerable act of faith. Be grateful for your warm blankets, for the silence that surrounds you, for the security that allows your mind to truly rest. And remember the legacy of those who fought through a harsh and unforgiving world so that a part of them could survive in you. Sweet dreams, and sleep well.